Evelyn did not notice at first when the quiet began to feel different. Her house had always been quiet, perched on the edge of the old town, a brick structure with ivy crawling along its side and windows that faced the woods. She had lived alone there for 6 years, ever since her husband had passed, and the stillness had become a kind of companion. But in early autumn, when the evenings came earlier and the trees darkened into silhouettes against the fading light, she began to sense something else living in the silence with her. It started with the phone. Some nights, just as she was preparing to go to bed, the old rotary phone in the hallway would ring. Not a full ring, but a single note, like the beginning of a call abruptly cut short. The first time it happened, she thought it was a glitch, the ancient wiring in the house betraying its age. The second time, she picked up the receiver, but there was only the empty hiss of the line. By the fifth time, she stopped answering altogether, though she could feel her pulse race every time that lone sound split the night. Her neighbors said nothing was strange. The old house creaked, they told her. The wires in that part of town were unreliable. She nodded and pretended to agree, but the reassurance did not settle her nerves. The sense of being watched began to creep into her evenings. She would close the curtains tightly, double-check the locks on the doors, yet still feel eyes tracking her from the darkened corners of the room. One evening, as she sat reading by the lamp in the living room, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps above her, slow, deliberate, as though someone were trying not to be heard. She froze, the book slipping from her fingers, and stared at the ceiling. The steps continued for several seconds, then stopped directly above her. The upstairs room was her husband's old study, locked since his death. She had never had reason to open it, and the key was tucked away in a drawer. Her breath caught, but she forced herself to move, grabbing a flashlight and creeping up the staircase. The door to the study stood closed, just as it always had. She pressed her ear against it, straining to catch any sound, but the silence was complete. Finally, with a trembling hand, she turned the knob. It was locked as always. Relief washed over her, but uneasily. She did not dare fetch the key. Instead, she returned downstairs, convincing herself it had been her imagination, the house shifting in the night. Yet the sound of those measured steps haunted her, replaying in her mind until dawn. Days passed, but the disturbances grew. The smell of cigarette smoke lingered in the hallway, though Evelyn had never smoked a day in her life. Small objects shifted places when she wasn't looking. A candlestick moved 2 inches to the left, a photograph facing the wrong way. She told herself she was simply forgetful, that age was playing tricks on her memory, but deep down she knew that was not the truth. She began to dream, vivid dreams that bled into waking. In them, she wandered the house at night, barefoot, hearing whispers that came from behind the locked study door. A man's voice, low and muffled, speaking words she could not understand. Sometimes in the dream, she would open the door, only to wake screaming before she could see what was inside. She kept the key close now in her pocket, as though some part of her knew the moment of confrontation was approaching. One rainy night, the power went out. Evelyn lit candles and sat in the kitchen, trying to calm herself with a cup of tea. The dogs in the neighborhood barked wildly, a cacophony that rose and fell as though something were moving through the streets, setting them off one by one. She tried to ignore it, but then she heard it again, the steps overhead. This time there was no mistaking them. They were heavier, more insistent. Her fear gave way to anger. She was tired of being afraid in her own home. She pulled the key from her pocket, seized the flashlight, and climbed the stairs. Her hands shook as she fitted the key into the lock. For a moment she hesitated, her heart hammering in her chest. But then she turned it. The door creaked open slowly, revealing the study exactly as she remembered. Dust-covered desk, shelves of books untouched for years, curtains drawn tight against the rain. She exhaled, half laughing at herself, until the flashlight beam swept across the far corner. There, carved into the plaster wall, were words she had never seen before. Faint but unmistakable. "I am still here." The flashlight slipped from her hand. It clattered against the floor, rolling, the beam twisting wildly across the books in the desk before settling on the wall again. The words were real, gouged deep into the plaster with some sharp object. Her breath came in shallow gasps. She stumbled backward, pulling the door shut and locking it once more, retreating to her bedroom where she barricaded the door with a chair. That night she did not sleep. She lay awake, listening. Once she thought she heard laughter, low, harsh, male, echoing faintly through the vents. She pressed her hands over her ears until the sound faded, rocking herself to silence. The following day she considered leaving, but where would she go? The house was her last connection to her husband, to the life they had built together. Selling it, abandoning it, felt like surrender. Instead, she began to research. At the library, she dug through old newspapers, searching for any history tied to her house. At first, she found nothing, just property records, notes about renovations. But then, buried in an old edition from 1956, she found a headline, "Local man found dead in Woodland House." The article described a man named Henry Lorne, who had lived in the same house decades earlier. He had been found in the upstairs study, a bullet wound in his chest. His death ruled a suicide, though neighbors whispered otherwise. His wife had disappeared shortly after, never to be seen again. Evelyn read the words again and again, the image forming in her mind. A man alone in the study, gun in hand, rage or despair twisting his final moments. She wondered if he had been buried properly, if the whispers of his neighbors had teeth. That night, she dreamed again. She was standing in the study, the words on the wall glowing faintly in the dark. A shadow loomed behind her, tall and indistinct, but when she turned, there was nothing there. She awoke drenched in sweat, the taste of smoke on her tongue. The disturbances intensified. The footsteps became nightly, the smell of smoke constant. Sometimes she felt a hand brush her shoulder as she passed through the hallway, though she was alone. Once, while she stood in front of the bathroom mirror, steam fogging the glass, she wiped it clean only to see another face reflected behind her. Hollow eyes, mouth twisted in a grimace, before it vanished. Her friends stopped visiting. She had tried to explain the strange things, but they only looked at her with pity, suggesting she see a doctor. She withdrew further, isolating herself. The house was no longer her companion. It was her captor. She felt its eyes on her, its breath in her ear. Then came the final night. Evelyn had resolved to end it, one way or another. She retrieved the key again, lit every lamp in the house, and marched to the study. She would not be terrorized anymore. She would confront whatever waited there. The air was suffocating as she opened the door. The smell of smoke was overwhelming, thick as though the room itself were burning, though no flames were visible. The words on the wall seemed deeper now, darker. She stepped inside, her heart pounding. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice breaking. "What do you want?" Silence, then a whisper so close it seemed to come from inside her own head. "I never left." The door slammed shut behind her. She spun, but the knob would not turn. The shadows lengthened, twisting, converging into the shape of a man. She saw him clearly now. The hollow eyes, the grimace, the suit stained dark across the chest. Henry Lorne. His mouth opened, and the room filled with the sound of laughter, the same harsh sound she had heard through the vents. Evelyn screamed. She beat at the door, clawed at the walls, but the laughter drowned her cries. The shadows engulfed her, pulling her down, wrapping her in suffocating black. And then, silence. When neighbors finally called the police, weeks later, complaining of the smell, the officers who entered the house found it empty. The study door was unlocked. The room was untouched, except for the words on the wall. But now beneath them, fresh letters had been carved, the edges sharp and raw. "She is with me." And from that night on, the house on Brookside Lane remained empty. No one bought it, no one entered it, save for the occasional daring child who ran up the steps on a dare and swore they heard laughter behind the locked study door. The ivy grew thicker, the shutters sagged lower, and the silence returned. But it was not the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of something waiting, patient and eternal, biding its time until another lonely soul dared to call it home.